our next keynote, really looking forward to this one's with Adrian Voorkamp. He's the Director of Learning Development for the Americas at Johnson Controls. And in his current role there with JCI, excuse me, which is a global Fortune 500 company, I believe they're with 389 last I checked. It's a building solutions company. He leads the deployment of sales leadership, and technical vocational training in North and Latin America, serving over 15,000 frontline sales and technical employees. And last year in 2019, JCI's enterprise learning team actually won 5 Brandon Hall Awards for performance support, leadership, senior leadership training, sales leadership training, best use of simulation, and best use of blended learning. So again, really looking forward to this one. He's going to be discussing L&D's new role, strategic business partners, and the rising impact on organizational success. So without further ado, everybody, please join me in welcoming Adrian Voorkamp. Adrian, go ahead, take it away.
Thanks, Bobby. Just really quick, can you guys hear my audio and see my video okay?
Yeah, everything looks good, Adrian.
All right, fantastic. So delivered a similar topic in last year's Opal group. And I'm really kind of passionate about viewing learning and development as a business partner and as a business element within the corporate enterprise. And I think one of the things that makes me really passionate about that is I've come from a background outside of L&D. And so I see a lot of my colleagues who are very much kind of dyed in the wool, learning and development folks with masters and PhDs in adult learning. And I hear a lot of conceptual things. And I think back to my sales background, and I think to myself, you know, all of this conceptual stuff is great, but we really need to measure things and we need to provide an ROI to the business. So that's really what I want to talk about today. So I want to spend a little bit of time just introducing myself, my background, and Johnson Controls as a company. And then we'll just dive really right into the meat of the presentation. So when I think about today's presentation, we're going to talk about 3 foundational concepts. The first one is avoiding the distractions and managing the business of L&D. Another way to say this would be running L&D like a business, because your stakeholders expect you to, whether or not you know it. Our stakeholders expect us to be able to quantify our value, to be able to measure our impact, and to be able to talk about our costs and our benefit ratios. Another thing that I want to talk about is this second idea of it's not learning, build it anyways. Part of how we, as a corporate learning function, build value to our partners in the business, whether that's in sales, whether that's in finance or frontline operations, is we build value by meeting their needs. One of the things that I've noticed that the L&D community is really, really good at is in some ways avoiding scope creep. And when we get asked to do things, you know, we might say something like, oh gosh, that's performance support, or that's communications. And what I want to talk about today is the importance of saying yes and building learning anyways, even when you're asked to create something that isn't necessarily building. And then the last piece I want to talk about is this idea of no learner left behind. I think if you can do these 3 things, you build a tremendous value to your stakeholders in the enterprise that employs you, either as a function, or if you're part of a smaller business, the enterprise that employs you as just an individual. Your learning team may just consist of you, right? So first, a little bit about Johnson Controls, and I won't spend too much time on this, but they are the ones who are employing me and paying me to be here. So Johnson Controls has well over 100,000 worldwide employees, 2,000 worldwide locations. We're doing close to $30 billion a year in annual revenue. We're in the Fortune Global 500. When I look at the awards that Johnson Controls has won, we take pride in being one of the world's most ethical companies, being a fantastic corporate citizen. And as a learning function within Johnson Controls, I'm so proud to be part of a team that's won multiple Brandon Hall Awards over the past several years. We have a really mature learning function with a ton of folks with instructional design, business development, just a really wide variety of backgrounds that are contributing to the learning that we deploy at Johnson Controls. So I want to hop right into the first piece. and so just avoiding the distractions and managing what I call the business of learning. Now, on the right side of my screen, you'll see one of our most beloved family members. Her name is Georgia. And she is very, very, very unhealthily fixated on squirrels. If I say the word squirrel, and she's actually in the house right now. So if I say the word squirrel, Georgia will run to the window, just like you see right here. And everything else in her world is tuned out. And you might think, well, why, Adrian, are you talking about dogs in an L&D conference? Well, I would say that as a trade, one of the things that I've noticed, having been an outsider to the trade of learning and development and now coming into L&D, is that we are one of the most distracted trades I have ever been a part of. I mean, we as an industry seem to hang on every word that Josh Burson comes out with, or the new technology, right? We're always talking about this new thing in learning. We're talking about gamification, micro-learning, e-learning, ILT, virtual ILT, learning management systems, learning experience platforms, digital adoption platforms. We have all of this stuff. And you know what the irony is? I try to attend conferences like these in a pre-COVID environment, in real interaction, but I try to do about 2 or 3 of these a year. And nearly all of them always open up asking all of the people that are attending the conference, what's the one thing you really want to get out of today's session? And inevitably, the top answer every single time, or at least the majority of times, always comes to measuring the impact of learning. And then we proceed to spend the entire balance of the time in that conference, talking about everything but measuring the impact of learning, because we're distracted. Somebody yelled squirrel, and we just turned our head, and now we're looking at virtual reality, augmented reality, all this other stuff, right? And when you think about what the business has been asking of us, what our internal customers have been asking us, you can see pretty quick how they can tend to get frustrated, because what tends to happen, the reason why we as a function are spending so much time trying to figure out how to measure learning is because our customers in the business are asking us to measure learning. And what we've gotten really adept at doing for the last decade has been saying, don't look at that, look at this. Look at this new e-learning module. Look at LXP, right? Look at Degree, look at EdCast, look at all these other things, but don't ask me to measure the impact of my learning. And so we're going to talk about how we avoid the distractions and how we actually start measuring the impact of learning. So what I want you to do right now, if you're listening in, is I want you to just real back of the envelope math. I want you to think through, how much do you cost your company? So if you're in a team of 1 and your learning function is just you, I want you to write that down, right? You know your salary, you know your travel expenses, your licensing fees, all that other stuff. If you're in this conference and you are a leader of a function, I want you to take a back of the envelope guess and see how much, if you can get to pretty close, if you can get to what you're costing your company. What am I talking about? Because you're going to find something out really, really eye-opening. I want you to think through salaries. I want you to think through travel and entertainment expenses. Obviously, you probably have some intellectual property that you license, maybe Franklin Covey or DVI or whatever that content is. You may have facilities that you use and that you have to. I want you to try as much as possible to come up with the answer to the question, how much do you cost the business? As you do that, I think one of the things that you'll find is that it's very, very easy to quantify your cost. Cost is the easiest thing in the world to measure. The challenge is that when we don't provide impact as a learning function, when we don't provide benefit, all we can provide, the only thing we can provide is how much we cost the organization. Now, we have some really great strategic leaders that understand the importance of learning generally, and they may be able to look at that 1 million, 2 million, 12 million, whatever that number is, they may be able to look at that and say, well, we need to do that because it's the right thing to do for employees. But I can tell you so much that, especially if you're a publicly traded company, your stakeholders are expecting an answer to the question of, well, how much of that investment, whatever that number that you wrote down is, how much of that investment is coming back with friends? How much of that investment is returning back to my organization? Always remember that your cost as an L&D professional in a company, your cost is visible to all of your stakeholders. And if you don't provide what that cost to benefit ratio is, you'll find that you continue to be winnowed down and down and down to the point where your function is there so that the business can say, yes, we have an L&D function, but your ability to execute on the strategies and the demands of the actual business is minimal. And the reason why is because you've never been able to quantify your value. So let's talk about some of what I see in the learning function. I'm not making these quotes up. I want to say that first. So there's a link in this slide. This is EduCause. When learning professionals were asked about measuring learning, these are some of the answers that learning professionals are giving. Let's look at the first one. Well, you can't measure that. It's too contextual. It's too idiosyncratic. It's so bound to the context with which it's used, you can't really measure it in a psychometrically meaningful way. That's from Daniel Hickey, who's the Associate Professor of Learning Sciences at Indiana University. Another quote from Gardner Campbell, who's a provost for learning intervention at Virginia Commonwealth, says, well, it depends on what you mean by measure. Why is it difficult to find reliable, simple proxy indicators of learning? More quotes, well, learning is everything from curiosity to memory. And then probably my favorite quotes is, well, measurement really involves constructs, like achievement. Achievement is a construct. Can you imagine for a second, just for a hot second, your CFO, your controller coming to you saying, I see that your function costs us $12 million a year. Can you measure the benefit of that $12 million? And you come back with something like, well, measurement really involves constructs. Constructs like achievement, right? Achievement is really just a construct. Or something like, you can't measure that. It's just too contextual. No, obviously we can't have that kind of conversation with our financial stakeholders. So what kind of conversations can we have and how do we pivot to providing data? So the first principle is data, 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 McData, data, data, so much data, right? The only thing as addictive to a business leader as cutting cost, the only thing that's as addictive as cutting cost is data. What tends to happen as learning professionals is we tend to look at all the things that we need to do to calculate ROI. If you're familiar with the Phillips ROI methodology and all the work that you have to go through, what we tend to do is we say, oh my gosh, I'm looking at all of these costs. I'm looking at all of this stuff that I have to do, and I can't even get this data or that data or this data. Here's what I would strongly encourage you to do. Use the data that you have and don't be afraid of the asterisk. So what do I mean by don't be afraid of the asterisk? Look, if you only have access to 3 of the 10 data points that you would need to calculate an ROI, then calculate your ROI based on those 3 data points. Because here's the thing, data is like Lay's chips, or I think it was Ruffles actually. If you remember this way back in the day, there used to be an advertising campaign where it says you can't have just one, right? Data is kind of similar. I've never left a meeting with an executive stakeholder where I've provided them value and they said, that was all the data I needed. I don't need any more data. What they always do is they say, well, what about this? Can you slice the data this way? Can you get this information? Now, here's the beauty of it. Remember, you used the asterisk and you told the business, here's the data that I was able to get. Now, you as a learning function, you're having a conversation with your frontline stakeholder that's about getting more value and getting more data and getting more tied in to your business and to your internal customer. So what I would encourage you to do is take a look at the metrics that you have today. You can begin reporting on. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Now, what are some of those metrics? Look, at the basic, bare bones minimum, think of learning like a factory. And the widget that you make is a learning hour. Today, you can start reporting out on learning hours. These are, if you have a 1 hour class that's in attendance by 10 people, you can start reporting out on learning hours, right? You can start reporting out on learning hours by type. You can start reporting out on things like net promoter score, things like capacity. These are all little pieces of metrics that you don't have to have an advanced finance degree to calculate. Now, inevitably, your business will come and say, well, what are we getting in exchange for those learners? And that's where you start having these conversations about getting access to the measurement tools that you need to be able to quantify that value. And don't be afraid of a negative return on investment. A negative return on investment is a good thing because it allows you to repurpose your spend into areas that are a more clear or concrete return on investment. The second thing that I said that we would talk about today, in addition to managing the business of L&D, is this idea of saying yes to your internal customers. One of the things I found that we do as a learning function is that's not training. We say it all the time because we're getting asked to do things that maybe we don't have the bandwidth to do. What I would encourage you to do, if you're running your function like a business and you're truly trying to be a strategic business partner, is to find a way to say yes. If they're asking you job as a learning professional, to find a way to sneak learning into it, right? The worst thing that any member of my team can do is say no to a stakeholder. And I know there's a lot of learning professionals that are on this call saying, oh my gosh, I can't, you're just a yes man, you're just saying yes. Absolutely, 100%. It's my job to say yes. It's my job to make sure that all the stakeholders that are coming to me are getting what they need and expect out of my function. The best problem in the world for me is that they're asking me to do things that aren't related to learning, because guess what? That means that they trust my function and my team enough to do that. So don't waste equity saying no. What you think of as learning is dramatically different, I promise you, is dramatically different from your stakeholders' definition of learning. It's your job to know how you can sneak it in. And remember too, that this ROI work that we're talking about, it starts before the deliverable is created. You need to start thinking about how do you measure success. The last piece that we'll talk about before we close is this idea of no learner left behind. If you think about what has to happen when a learner in a company raises their hand and says, I need learning, their manager has to approve it. Maybe a regional director has to approve it. There's cost that has to be attained. There's a license that has to get purchased, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This idea of no learner left behind is this ethos that is part of in my opinion, of a highly successful and highly functioning L&D team. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to helicopter in a bunch of trainers and drop them off at a branch or at a location and do a 5-day in-person session. But you have to find a way to say yes when that learner raises the hand, because the amount of obstacles that learner has to typically go through to get learning is usually overburdening. And the very last piece that I'll talk about is this idea of program management. You should probably fire all of your program managers and hire instead, or at least repurpose your program managers into being business partners. Now, I can't take the credit for this. This came from Scott, who used to be the CLO at Farmers Insurance. And he said, I fired all my program managers and I rehired them as business partners. What I've told folks when they join my organization is, my best case scenario for you is that you wake up one day, you're in a meeting and you're looking around the room and you're saying to yourself, why the heck am I in this meeting? And the answer to that question is because the business couldn't imagine having that meeting without you. If that's the case, then you've arrived. And what I mean by that is, when you're a program manager, the business just tends to think of you as this person that manages the new hire program, or this person that manages the ethics program, right? When you are a business partner, that business thinks of you as the keys to solving their problems, whether or not those are learning related problems. So I'm going to put a neat little bow on all this because I think I'm at time. Number one, don't be afraid of what the data says or where it takes you. Aggressively target ROI, and don't be afraid to asterisk. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. You have to provide something. So provide what you can put an asterisk on it. And when the business unit leader says, what's all that stuff say that you weren't able to get? You're now having a conversation with them about getting more deeply embedded in their business so that you can provide a more meaningful ROI. And then lastly, hire business partners, not program managers. So Bobby, I think I am at time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share and turn it back to you.
Okay, yeah, we got a few questions for you, Adrian, here. I think the first one.
Bobby, if you're on mute or stuck, I can't hear you.
Oh.
I hear you perfectly fine, Bobby.
Oh, okay, good. All right. Yeah, I didn't see that I was muted or anything. Can you hear me now, Adrian?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, since I'm asking you the question, I guess it's probably good that you can hear me, right? Yeah, just wanted to jump in with the first one. Looks like you've got one from our good buddy Austin.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wants to know. Apparently, he's been hearing from others in the industry about a constant hurdle. Wants to know, how do you collect all the costs across the business to measure an effective ROI?
So number one, you ask for it, and number two, you take what you can get. So it's this idea of accepting the asterisk. So yes, the constant hurdle is the business either doesn't have the data that you need or doesn't want to make it available to you. The first one you can't really do a lot about. The second one is probably more of or could be a reflection of how you manage your stakeholders or how you manage the business. If they don't trust you to provide key data, then you probably need to go back to the drawing board and look at how you're managing that overall relationship. But I know this sounds really obvious. I don't mean to just kind of brush it off, but you have to ask. You have to ask for the data and you have to explain why you're asking for the data.
So as a follow-up to that, and hope this doesn't sound like an insulting question by any means, but is measurement just for measurement's sake, is that really valuable?
Yeah. I mean, so yes, 100%. And there's probably people that disagree with that, but absolutely. And I will say this, I'll put the asterisk on that of if you're in a publicly traded company. If you're in a company that has an obligation to maximize shareholder value and maximize profit, then yes, measurement for measurement's sake is important, because if you can't measure and document your benefit, the organization has an obligation, has a moral obligation to stop spending money on you. So you have to be able to measure something. Yes, measurement for measurement's sake is 100% value added, because what will happen is they will always ask you for more or deeper levels of measurement, and that's where you start to really build those relationships.
And how much pushback do you get on that? I mean, I know that you had prefaced the answer to that question by saying some people might kind of disagree with that. Have you found that internally, that some people don't necessarily agree with that? And if so, how do you overcome that?
So within my team, we have a lot of folks who view, I get knocked a couple times because I view learning as a factory. And we have people who have doctorate degrees in education and adult learning. And they wince at the idea of learning as a factory. They view learning as this art, as this intrinsically valuable thing. And it is, and I don't mean to disqualify that, but learning in a corporate and a professional setting is closer to a factory than it is an art, because we don't have the luxury of giving all these kind of wishy-washy answers to how much do you benefit us. We have to be able to provide a benefit. So I would say yes, within the L&D function, I get a huge amount of kickback about constantly measuring and finding a way to measure everything. And then what I've found in a COVID environment is that all of that measurement really protects my team members. Because what I've seen happen across the industry these last 8 months is I've seen, carpet bombing of L&D functions and getting cost out of L&D. I've seen whole functions eliminated and roles eliminated. And I look at that and I look at my team and I see much smaller cuts. And the reason why we had much smaller cuts was because we were able to quantify everything. When they asked us, how many learning hours did you produce? I could provide an answer. When they said, what % utilized is every member of your team? I could answer that. And I could tell them how those utilization hours worked out. Oh, well, Bobby spent 40 hours doing facilitation, or he spent 25 hours doing facilitation, 10 hours doing content creation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what we found is that while there was some pushback within the L&D function in the beginning, we've seen that that data really helps protect the integrity of the function and protect the cost around the function. And so it really ends up being what saves a lot of L&D functions and a lot of roles.
All right, so kind of sticking with the measurement a little bit, I'm going to just pivot to how important is the survey that you use, just as opposed to the questions that you ask.
I'd say the questions are far more important than the instrument. You can use a whole host of, we use a tool called Metrics That Matter, but you don't need to have a license-based software as a service type subscription. What's important is the questions. Net Promoter Score is an example. That's a defined question. You can go to Wikipedia and you can look that up right now. That's also a metric that your business is likely very familiar with, because if you have a customer-facing business, they are likely measured by Net Promoter Score. Things like estimated performance improvement, right? You can ask the question in SurveyMonkey or anything else, how much do you think your performance will improve as a result of taking this training? You can ask a follow-up question like, how much will your training, how much of that improvement is because of the training that you took, right? Scrap learning, you can ask what % of this training. The questions are more important than the actual instrument itself.
Did that play a key role in how many pilots you may have tested, or how many different types of tech instruments that you looked at, understanding that the question's more important than that?
I would say the one thing that we've paid a lot of attention to is benchmarks. We place a lot of importance on benchmarks, and the primary reason why we use a service for our surveys is because it gives us access to benchmarks. If I say, as an example, to my customer, that Bobby, the instructor, got a 4.6 out of 5 points. Okay, like, so what, right? How do I know that 4.6 is good, right? But if I go to my stakeholder and I say, Bobby, the instructor, got a 4.6, which compares favorably to people in multinational, industrials. And when they have corporate universities, their instructors typically rate at a 4.2. So we're exceeding this external benchmark. And that's probably one of the benefits of choosing an instrument that is that has benchmarks in it, as opposed to doing a homebrewed thing. But if you don't have the budget for an instrument like Metrics That Matter, and instead you just have a free SurveyMonkey account, you can ask all those questions in a free SurveyMonkey account. You're not going to get the benchmark, but you are going to get the benefit of understanding what your impact is. And they don't have to be these statistically, crazy thought out questions. You can just ask a simple question like, how likely are you to recommend a friend or a colleague to this training? Do you think this training is going to improve your job? Was the environment beneficial? Start thinking about the questions that your stakeholders are asking you, and then ask your learner those questions.
Yeah, no, it seems to come back always again to the importance of the questions that you ask. And you'd mentioned benchmarks, and that's where I was going to follow up next with the question. Is that why, or can you explain why you place such an importance on those benchmarks?
Yeah, so for me, being able to provide my stakeholders with a comparison that says our scrap learning rate, as an example, is 14% for most of our technical learning. Now, first of all, most of my stakeholders in finance and operations don't understand what the heck scrap learning is, right? Scrap learning, for those of you that don't know, is the % of learning that's given that is not applied on the job. Well, 14%, if I tell you that number and you're in finance, you're saying, oh my gosh, you mean to tell me that you waste 14% of our learners' time? Well, yeah, but just so you know, all corporate universities, they average around 33%. So our 14% is actually significantly overperforming.
Okay, outstanding stuff as anticipated. Thank you so much in sharing all the insight into how Johnson Controls kind of created the team of professionals that are really so deeply embedded into the business. Having them seen as true business partners is obviously critical to the success of the enterprise. And thanks so much for sharing that, giving examples and talking about the importance of questions and benchmarks. So, on behalf of everybody in the audience, just want to thank you again so much for joining us, Adrian.
You bet. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Of course.